Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for education and information, where we share information about frontline action on everything to do with sustainability to inspire, we hope, collaboration and action. We have a fascinating discussion coming up today about a new book on the very important topic of how on earth we can take real world action on everything related to climate change by Ian Monroe. And we will also have in this discussion Alison Garcad, who will talk about emerging climate solutions, amongst other things. And we have also Ariane Tang, who will help to move the discussion along and keep it lively and interesting. Just as a very brief welcome to everybody, please do say hello in the chat. Please do contribute your thoughts as we go through in the chat function. Please if you have questions, you can use the Q&A. That's the easiest for us, then we can keep track of them most easily. And if you are watching on social media, please do share, please use the like button. If you do, then more people get to learn about these incredibly important topics. Just as a very brief introduction to why all of this is so important, we know in the world of investment into the energy transition, this is the Bloomberg New Energy Finance data that many of you would have seen. We've now gone past $1 trillion a year being invested. We need something like twice that amount, maybe $2 to $3 trillion a year, to be at the level that's really required to deliver the transition. So we are on the way, but we're nothing like there yet. And one of the other fascinating pieces of information to have come out recently is just to see where is the investment going in terms of the creation of the factories required to build the equipment and cars to deliver that energy transition. And as you'll see in the bars on the right of this graphic, it is almost all in China. The West is an enormously long way behind, although that is not often repeated in the news. The other part of this, which I think is incredibly important for all of us, is that all of this action has to be taken in a way which is as inclusive as possible. We can't just worry about our own countries and our own communities. So I'm fascinated to see how that theme comes out as we progress through. So with no more ado, I will hand over to my co-host Paul Herman in France to introduce the discussion a little further. Paul, over to you.
Thanks, Nigel. Welcome, everybody. Great to have all of us together on ESGX. This is number 82 ESGX, and for those of you who are with us at the very beginning, Ian Monroe was a guest on ESGX number 1 that launched during COVID at the end of March. So since March 2020, we've set up a whole series of conversations to take action, to get educated, and to help provide a pathway for how we can solve the climate crises and the associated crises as well. Ian has been leading Ian Monroe has been leading Etho Capital since its founding, as well as being a professor at Stanford University. And so the latest book, this is part of the book launch with his co-author that we'll talk about today and dig into details. And Alison and Ariane are here to help provide real, tangible examples of what's happening. So really excited about that. And then just one disclaimer disclosure before we get started. HIP Investor, which I founded 17 years ago, allocates to the Etho Exchange Traded Fund, which is part of our HIP fossil fuel-free portfolios. And Ian will share some information about that fund during this presentation as well. But it's mainly a how-to for society, for systems, on how to move forward. I'm going to show one slide before we dig in, and then hand it off. And that slide is this, which is when we talk about the climate, you can see this carbon budget, and Ian's going to provide a more detailed version of this, of how to take all that carbon and run it down. But what's super important is you're going to hear things like 1 degree Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius. Sometimes you might even hear 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius. If we do nothing, we're headed for that higher pathway. So taking action today is super important. But at least in the US, we talk about Fahrenheit versus Celsius. So usually you can almost double Celsius to Fahrenheit. And that means if the world's temperature was your own body temperature, this is a good way to think about it, and your own body temperature went up 1 or 2 degrees Celsius or 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit, you would have a fever. You'd have 101, 102 fever. And that fever that we're talking about will be persistent unless we take action for climate change. And if we did nothing, that fever would be 7 to 10 degrees above your body temperature. And basically you'd have the equivalent of Ebola or you would die. So it's super important for us to take action. Feel free to use this framework when explaining to other people these scientific terms around Celsius and Fahrenheit and relate it to body temperature. And that usually helps clarify and focus the mind. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Oriane Tang, and she's a co-founder of the Climate Positive Alliance, along with HIP Investor and others. So we'll talk about that during this conversation as well. So Oriane, thanks for joining us. Thanks for your leadership, and look forward to learning more about how to solve for climate change.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. I am Oriane. I'm excited to be here to talk about amazing climate solutions, and thanks for the much needed reminder of the emergency that we are all facing. I have a background in finance and sustainability. I'm based in London, originated from France. I've been involved in the climate and finance space for a few years now, and including as part of the Climate Positive Investing Alliance that many people on this panel are members of, and that hopefully you'll have a chance to look at and join if that's something that is interesting for you. We'll drop the link in the show notes. And I pass over to our wonderful panelists today, Ian and Alison. And just before that, I remind every one of you of the Q&A function. Don't hesitate to just drop a question that you'd have to keep this conversation as live and interactive as possible. And we'll also have a dedicated session for questions at the end. But yeah, again, the aim is to have this session interactive. And Ian, do you want to take over? I guess you're on mute.
Thanks so much. I will actually first pass it over to Alison to introduce herself, and then I'll dive into a few slides here. So Alison, thanks for joining us. Tell us more about yourself.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ian. So my name is Alison Gakad. I'm calling from Vancouver, BC, up in northern Canada, also known as the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I'm a climate tech journalist based here in Vancouver, but I also cover a lot of climate policy, and I'm really excited to amplify the solutions that I've really been seeing on the ground here in Canada. So excited to pass it back over to Ian to walk us through how exactly we're going to solve climate change.
Thanks so much, Alison, and thanks to all of you for joining us and the ESGX crew for keeping this going for now over 80 episodes and many more to come, I'm sure, which is fantastic. So I'll be going into the high-level framework that we talk about in this new Solving Climate Change book that just came out, that's actually originally designed as a college textbook, and I co-authored it with John Coomey, who's someone I've been teaching climate solution courses with at Stanford for years. And I won't go into our bios, but suffice to say, we've been working on many aspects of climate change for decades, originally as scientists and engineers and solutionists, and then have continued to teach in academia as well. And now, as Paul mentioned, I work in the investment world as my day job at Etho Capital, but I still teach courses on climate solutions at Stanford and elsewhere. And this book really came out of John and I teaching these courses at Stanford on climate solutions and being a bit shocked that there wasn't a good climate solution textbook out there. There were books on climate science and why climate change is a problem, and some aspects of solutions like renewable energy technology books. But we really wanted to put something that put all the pieces of technological decarbonization of our economy together alongside finance and policy and incentives and communication around what has to happen with climate. So the book really starts from the premise that I assume everyone on this webinar already is at, which is just climate change is happening and it's really bad. We don't need to argue about whether or not it's happening. Every scientific organization agrees, virtually every government and company agrees that climate change is, in the words of Dr. Kimberly Nicholas, who wrote the foreword for our book, real climate change. It's happening because of our actions. It's us. It's really bad. We're sure. What we're really focusing on in this conversation and what the book focuses on is we can fix it. And there are all sorts of solutions already in play to make the fixing happen in ways that actually have tremendous co-benefits. But we really, to Paul's earlier point, we really better hurry, because the longer we take to act in big, meaningful ways, the worse the problem will become because of the nature of climate emissions building up in the atmosphere every year and staying there for thousands of years if we don't act to remove them. So climate change, we're all seeing it in our backyards. If you look globally, over 90% of people in almost every country in the world understands now that climate change is happening, because we're seeing it in extreme weather events and more violent storms and wildfires like those that are currently going on in Canada and Allison's backyard right now. And certainly here in Northern California, where I'm based, we've seen these fires happen with increasing intensity and really extreme consequences. But they're happening everywhere. We're also, on the flip side, seeing record floods in many parts of the world, including even in places like California that are also experiencing fires. And then, of course, there's drought. And then there's floods and famine and conflict and crime and war that even can be connected up to all these extreme impacts from climate change that we're already seeing. And for me, this is unfortunately extremely personal. I grew up on a small farm in Northern California, and I've seen it devastated by one of these huge wildfires in 2017 that destroyed my family's homes. Over 20 family members lost homes overnight. Some of our neighbors got trapped in their homes and died because the fire was moving on hurricane force winds that just pushed the flames much faster than people could even run. And this is something, again, it's happening everywhere. And if the fires aren't affecting you directly here in Northern California, you're breathing toxic air for several months out of the year, almost every year now, because of the smoke from these fires, which again are happening right now in parts of Canada. This is what the climate science says needs to happen. And really important to note, particularly for the ESG investing community that tunes in to these conversations on ESGX, it is no longer enough to get to net zero emissions by 2050. Net zero emissions, of course, is the tipping point where we're actually not putting in new pollution into the atmosphere. But because we've waited to act, because we haven't acted for the last 20 years when net zero by 2050 originally was put out by scientists, because it would have been sufficient then, we actually need to decarbonize even faster. We actually need, as a globe, around net zero by 2040. And importantly, net zero is just the transition point. It's the point where we're not putting in new pollution into the atmosphere, but actually to get back to a healthy, stable climate that humans and every other species evolved with, that would reverse the climate damages as much as we can that are already happening, we actually have to get to net climate positive, where we're removing more emissions than are going up into the atmosphere. And so this chart is showing that transition from our current level of pollution to net zero, and then beyond that to net positive, where we actually have net removals. And importantly, you'll see in this transition that we have to effectively stop using all fossil fuels as part of this transition to net climate positive. And we also need a whole lot of carbon removal to remove the pollution that's already up in the atmosphere. So it's not enough to just stop new pollution. So it's also important to understand that even the 1.5 degree warming limit of the Paris Climate Agreement, it's still a limit. Really, it's not a goal. We should not be aiming for a 1.5 degree warmer world, because that world already has even more wildfires and floods and droughts and conflict and famine than we're seeing already connected to climate change. So really 1.5 degrees, we're hoping to keep warming under that, but we should be aiming ultimately to return to effectively 0 degrees of warming, to the healthy, stable climate that we all have evolved with as humans and every other species. And a 1.5 degree world is going to be a much worse world than we're currently in. So really the goal is to transition to net climate positive as quickly as possible. So the book is all about how to get there. And there are 3 essential elements of getting to net climate positive. We effectively have to end our use of all fossil fuels, not just coal, but also oil and gas. We also have to minimize non-fossil emissions, so methane, for example, from livestock and other sources, and also carbon dioxide from deforestation. And then we need to transition our planet's biosphere, its oceans and its land base, including ag and forest, from being a net source of climate pollution to actually being a net sink, where we're removing more pollution than we're putting up there. And we need to be working on all these aspects essentially from every angle, from bottom-up community action to company level action to investors and donors, and of course, governments and policymakers at all levels. And in the book, a core piece of what we talk about, which we're going to get into some examples of solutions and action in these different categories, are 8 elements of climate action that need to happen. 8 essential pillars, 8 climate action pillars. And they start with electrifying everything and decarbonize electricity, but also essentially we need to focus on minimizing these non-fossil greenhouse gases, including a focus on efficiency and optimization, really around decarbonization everywhere, and then removing the emissions that are already up there as well. So those are the technological pillars. And beyond technological pillars, we also need to make sure we're aligning incentives properly, we're mobilizing money properly, and we're elevating truth about which solutions are actually solutions in the context that they can be scaled up. So there's a lot of talk about electrification in the context of electric vehicles, and it's great to see this transition really starting to scale up, with virtually every major automaker now committing to fully electrifying their vehicle fleets. Importantly, electrification isn't just for vehicles, though. We really need to be electrifying every part of the economy that we can, including every aspect of home energy use and office energy use, and things beyond personal vehicles, including industrial vehicles and also industrial processes like the making of steel, for example. And there are many exciting technologies now on the horizon that are electrifying even really hard to electrify industrial processes. I put up one example here. Boston Metal has a fully electrified steel making process they're working on scaling up at commercial level now, and there are a number of others that are working on electrified steel, electrified cement, other types of electrified industrial facilities. And beyond vehicles, another piece of electrification that really literally comes home for all of us is electrifying our cooking and our home energy use more broadly. So there are a number of exciting electrification startups that are out there in the cooking space. There's a company called Channing Street Copper Company here, the San Francisco Bay Area, that has induction stove and range that has a battery built into it, which enables it to be installed just as a drop-in, even if you have a gas range right now, without any new wiring whatsoever. And then the fact it has a battery also enables it to actually use the battery either in a blackout or just during peak demand times. So that then allows you to pay less for the energy that you're using, and it also helps reduce the grid strain from you using electricity for cooking. And then the battery can be recharged when there's cheaper energy on the grid. And that effectively also helps get more renewables out there. Actually, just here in the San Francisco Bay Area, they have a competitor, a company called Impulse, which is also making battery integrated, really high-end cooktops. In this case, they're drop-in cooktops as opposed to the oven and range integrated system that Copper has, but pretty similar and both super cool products. But you don't have to spend thousands of dollars upgrading your stove as a starting point. Actually, a lot of people are starting with just electric hot plates that start around $100, or an electric water kettle that could be cheaper than $20. And there are also companies like Span, which has a smart panel, which enable homes to electrify without doing a whole bunch of additional rewiring, and they can shift loads around to make sure that breakers aren't in conflict and getting overloaded. So there are a lot of really exciting home electrification technologies that are coming into play, and these are just as important, and in some cases, perhaps even more important than the electric vehicle technologies that we talk about that are scaling up. Of course, as we're electrifying, we need to make sure that that electricity is as clean as possible in terms of carbon pollution and other types of pollution. And so decarbonizing our grid is a piece of any scalable climate plan. That means solar and wind and geothermal and hydro wherever possible. It also means energy storage in the form of batteries or older systems like pumped hydro that enable us to have renewable energy become 24/7 available energy and become what's called base load power. And we can do this either through large utility sales systems or also with home systems that have batteries integrated, which can happen at the full home level with something like a Tesla Powerball, or they can happen even at the individual device level now, like the battery integrated electric cooking systems that we were just talking about. This is a chart I won't get to in detail, but suffice to say, it's showing that renewable energy, specifically in grid scale solar power and onshore wind energy, is now on average the cheapest source of energy everywhere that it's going in. So on average, wind and solar are now cheaper than combined cycle natural gas plants and much cheaper than coal. And those cost curves have generally come down every single year, actually with last year being the one exception because of inflation issues, but that's also caused fossil fuels to be more expensive as well. So wind and solar are still the cheapest forms of energy on average pretty much everywhere if you look at levelized cost of electricity. And to really get to 100% renewable energy grids, it's entirely possible, but energy storage has to be a big part of what we do to ensure that we have renewable energy all the time, even if the sun isn't shining or wind isn't blowing. And Allison, as a clean tech journalist, has been covering a really cool company that's helping both do circular economy things and make energy storage cheap. So Allison, can you tell us a little bit more about Moment Energy and what you've seen that they're doing there?
Yeah, Moment Energy has found a really interesting solution when it comes to retired electric vehicle batteries. So when it comes to the end of the lifespan of your typical electric vehicle, there's actually still a capacity of about 80% in terms of its ability to still be in service. So what the co-founders of Moment Energy did was create a battery pack essentially composed of retired electric vehicle batteries that they've stacked on top of each other. And how they're starting to deploy it is actually in these situations of renewable technologies that are generating renewable electricity. So for example, as Ian mentioned, when it comes to solar and wind and that issue of intermittent energy being produced, employing a energy storage solution like Moment Energy will allow for electricity to power whatever needs to be powered, even in times when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. Moment Energy has entered into really interesting agreements with automakers. As we mentioned, that all automakers are starting to move towards electric vehicles, and they're figuring out, what do we do with our retired electric vehicle battery? And so now, instead of going through the recycling process, which can at times be pollutive in its own process, they're sending it over to Moment Energy, and they're figuring out how to take these battery packs and allow them to power remote communities and indigenous communities, especially here in North America, that operate off the grid. And really, it allows for a circular economy solution that allows for and encourages clean energy and electrification.
And I'll just give a quick plug. Thanks a lot, Allison, for that additional detail. I'll also plug Lazard as a great source of information regarding what's going on with relative economics in the energy industry. They're the ones who put out this chart, and they, on a pretty frequent basis, update exactly how renewables compare with different fossil energy sources. And what's important to realize about this chart is that actually, to be price competitive, renewable energy plus energy storage like batteries needs to really compete with the gas peaker plants, which that's the second most expensive source of energy right now, relative to, well, nuclear is the most expensive. You can see it just passed it up, but that's already really expensive power. And so already in a lot of places, it's actually cheaper to have solar plus a battery and or wind plus a battery to provide that 24/7 continuous baseload power than it is to be using that peaker plant during those peak demand times. So we have to, of course, think beyond the electrification and renewable energy sides of the climate equation, and also look at what's going on with non-fossil sources of climate pollution. We often talk about deforestation and emissions from livestock, particularly cows, as being important pictures, rather important pieces of the climate picture. And they certainly are. We do need to end planetary deforestation as quickly as we possibly can, and also conserve other types of high carbon ecosystems like peatland, and ideally even reforest areas that have been deforested already. The more we're shifting towards plant-based diets and alternative meat and dairy substitutes, the more that helps in that transition. And there are things we can do to manage methane as best we can, even with existing animal agriculture, including some really exciting catalytic and algae-based feeds now for cows. They can dramatically reduce the methane that they produce just as their regular chewing on food and burping up methane living process. Another big source of methane is actually rice. The way that we grow rice can have big variations in methane emissions. And so shifting towards smarter rice cultivation techniques and varieties that minimize methane production is another thing we can do. We're never going to be able to get to entirely zero non-fossil greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really about minimizing as best we can, and then having other technologies that have carbon removal, for example, to get us beyond net zero to net climate positive. Another source of emissions that may actually be somewhat surprising is contrails for flying around in airplanes. Actually, just those clouds have substantial warming impacts. But again, we can manage how those contrails are formed with flights, and there's smart software that can direct flights to fly at different altitudes to minimize contrail formation. And contrails don't necessarily go away if we're switching to, say, hydrogen as an aviation fuel. So even if we're shifting to a zero carbon emissions fuel, there still are warming impacts associated with aviation unless we tweak around our systems and reduce those. Another big source of climate pollution that isn't direct fossil fuel emissions, at least not entirely, is the cement industry, where just cooking limestone in a conventional clinkering process releases a lot of CO2. Exciting to hear there are also a number of clean cement technologies now that are not just electrifying cement production, but actually creating cement in new ways that doesn't produce all that climate emissions in the process.
And on the previous slide, I see that the audience is reacting with a remark from Francisca about also the ocean's potential to sequester CO2. There was also a question during the registration phase about the potential of for terrestrial forests to be able to capture that. Would you be maybe able to dig a bit more on this topic that you mentioned with the reforestation and fighting deforestation before?
And just before you do, Ian, I'll just explain this picture I popped up here, which is to this point about lime and cement. This is a plant in Belgium, which is an innovative kiln for lime and cement, running at about 30,000 tons a year, which captures all the CO2. If you build this thing from new, if you're building a new kiln, there's no marginal operating cost, there's no marginal capital cost, and it's now being built, a version of this being built with Heidelberg cement in Germany at 100,000 ton a year size, which is about a fifth of the average cement plant. And if you were doing this at full scale, you just build 5 of these. So this is kind of here now technology being built as first of a kind at full scale, but it's a great example of one of the things which is not necessarily well talked about, but is here already.
Great example, Nigel. Thanks a lot for sharing that. And I'll continue with the flow because I'm going to get into carbon removal, where that's, I think, the best place to talk about both the role of forests and the role of our oceans in climate solutions. Before getting there, just quickly want to touch on efficiency and optimization. Often, previously, climate solution conversations would start here. They'd start talking about efficiency as a low-hanging fruit. We just need to make our devices more energy efficient. And that certainly is true, but there's no way we can solve climate change through efficiency alone. Efficiency makes everything easier. The more we optimize our systems, the fewer emissions they produce, the easier they are to decarbonize beyond that. And in the book, we talk about thinking about efficiency and optimization beyond just energy efficiency, but really efficiency around attaining a desired outcome. So for your diet, thinking about plant-based foods as actually just a more efficient way to eat, particularly if you can get a plant-based burger that is really similar to whatever conventional burger you're used to eating, for example. And even more broadly, I think we should be thinking about efficiency in terms of what it takes to really fulfill ourselves as humans. And a lot of efficiency may actually be around just more mindful consumption and effectively using less and being just as happy, if not happier, in the lifestyles that we choose. So those are kind of bigger philosophical questions, but that's actually one of the most common feedbacks we've gotten from early readers of the book is where does just using less come into the equation? And it's really thinking about efficiency and optimization in our overall systems, just for our personal lives, for our entities as organizations, and thinking about the ultimate desired outcome and goal, and then what's the most efficient way to get there in terms of the materials that we use, as well as the resources that we use and what we consume overall. And certainly we want to be promoting switching to systems that at the same time, just in general, are innovating and reducing emissions in every aspect of our lives. There are some efficiency aspects that have been forced upon us lately with our COVID realities, like remote work, that actually just is elevated that, hey, we don't really need to be getting on planes all the time to go around to have meetings, or even getting in a vehicle all the time to go into the office to do work that would have us staring at a computer the same way we could be staring at a computer at home. So that gets into efficiency of outcomes, efficiency of ultimate goals, and that bigger picture thinking there. And we're even seeing governments now banning inefficient technologies, banning inefficient lights, for example, and now starting to ban even internal combustion engine vehicles in a number of countries. So that's another way that efficiency can get forced to scale up much more quickly. One of the most exciting technologies in terms of electrification also is a massive improvement in terms of efficiency. And that's actually true for a whole lot of electrification technologies. Electric vehicles are just much more efficient at transferring energy to wheels to move you around than an internal combustion engine is. That's where all that heat comes from in a nice vehicle, right? It's all inefficiency. Speaking of heat, if you want to heat or cool your home, by far the most efficient way to do that is to use a heat pump. And you can also use that to heat or cool your water. And so scaling up heat pump technology in homes and office buildings everywhere both helps with electrification and renewable energy integration. It also helps make systems just inherently more efficient. So getting into forests and oceans, they need to be a big piece of carbon removal, which, as mentioned, is really essential for solving climate change. It's no longer enough to just get to net zero, to hold emissions at zero. We now need to get to the point where we're actually going climate positive, aka carbon negative, where we're removing the emissions that are already up in the atmosphere. The biggest challenge with carbon removal technologies is permanence, and whether or not that carbon that's being removed is going to stay out of the atmosphere, ideally for thousands of years. And any sort of natural systems have a challenge with impermanence that unfortunately is only getting heightened with climate change. And I've seen this personally as I've actually worked on a number of forest carbon projects around the world. And I've even worked on a project up in Oregon that verified a bunch of carbon offsets through more sustainable forest management, but then that forest went up in a wildfire. And so all that carbon benefit that was legitimately accruing all of a sudden literally went up in smoke. And that's not to say that we shouldn't work to make our land-based systems and agricultural systems and our ocean ecosystems as carbon sequestering as possible. But it does mean that we can't only do that. That is a key part of shifting our terrestrial ecosystems and our ocean ecosystems to being a climate solution, to make them climate sponges rather than sources of climate emissions. And actually already the vast majority of climate pollution has been getting absorbed in the ocean, and it's also making the ocean more acidic, which is increasing problems. But we also have to think beyond natural systems to augmented natural systems with engineered systems where we're locking up carbon and putting it deep underground or turning it into solid things like rock that lock that carbon up again for hundreds or thousands of years, not potentially just a few decades on average if we're talking about natural systems. So we need those natural systems. Ocean ecosystems can be a big part of climate solutions for sure, but natural systems alone aren't going to get us there. We really need to focus on permanence, and engineered solutions are going to have to be part of that. One of the companies doing really cool long-term permanent carbon removal here, also in my backyard in San Francisco area, is called Charm Industrial. They're taking waste biomass from agriculture, starting with corn, and they're also looking at waste biomass from forestry and some wildfire management related biomass. And they're converting it into what they call bio oil, which you can see there on the left of the slide, that then they actually inject underground in depleted fossil fuel fields. And then that bio oil locks that carbon up for thousands of years. And it's one of the more exciting and one of the more scalable carbon removal technologies. It's essentially a reverse oil process where plants are doing the work, and then their systems take that waste biomass, you can see a picture of the corn stover they're currently working with, and again, convert it into an oil, put that underground. There also are cool technologies scaling up that are doing enhanced mineralization. There's one called Project Vesta, which is taking mafic rock and speeding up the natural process of weathering that takes CO2 out of the atmosphere. And in this case, they're putting that on coastlines to help reverse the process of coastal degradation, reverse the process of sand beach loss that's going on because of sea level rise. Climeworks is a company that's actually just got these giant machines that's sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, and then they're injecting that underground. And ARCA is another exciting technology that Allison's been covering. So I'll let her explain more about what ARCA is up to and what makes them exciting.
Yeah, I think I've been starting to see quite a bit of momentum when it comes to carbon removal, of coupling the challenge of carbon removal with these industries that have historically emitted the carbon emissions and are trying to figure out how they can reduce their carbon emissions. And it's encouraging to see innovations trend towards permanent carbon removal. So ARCA is an example of a startup based here in Vancouver that works with mine tailings, which are byproducts of mining. So for example, a nickel site could host 1% nickel, and 99% of the rock essentially goes to waste and is known as ultramafic rock. And this byproduct of mining can actually be used to store carbon and remove carbon from the atmosphere through mineralization as well. So it's exciting to see what has historically been regarded as a waste product in the mining industry be used as a climate solution and really potential for permanent carbon removal.
And Judy, just to address your point, I actually teach with Mark Jacobson at Stanford, has guest lectured for my courses, and he wrote us a nice little blurb about the book that's on the solveclimate.org site. I would say they actually do agree with this overall framework where natural systems have to be a key piece of carbon removal, but there's no way that we solve climate change without carbon removal being a huge piece. If you look at all the climate models, carbon removal is in there. That's everything below zero. That's everything net climate positive and beyond. So that doesn't mean we stop emissions as net sources, but there's just absolutely no way that we hold to 1.5 degrees warming and go beyond that to get back to the healthy, stable climate around 280 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere that humans evolved with every other species, without carbon removal being massively scaled. We do need to figure out who's going to pay for that. And certainly I would argue those that have been profiting from pollution should be paying the most for it. But there's even some interesting proposals around creating a new currency to pay for scaling up carbon removal that we get into a little bit in the book. I know we're starting to get short on time, so I'm going to fly through pretty quickly the next few slides and then just get towards some more open Q&A at the end. Getting beyond the technical pillars, we really need to ensure that we're aligning incentives for all stakeholders to be benefiting from carbon dioxide removal and avoidance of emissions as much as possible, and certainly not just CO2. All stakeholders need to be benefiting from decarbonizing our economy as much as possible. And a lot of the problems around our current system are related to misaligned incentives, where polluters are not paying the price of their pollution and profiting from continuing to pollute as opposed to decarbonize. And it's not just about getting technologies cheaper. As we talked about, wind and solar are already cheaper, but there are all still a whole lot of misaligned incentives in our systems to keep these technologies from scaling up as quickly as they can scale up. And certainly a lot of these misaligned incentives relate to those that are profiting from pollution currently, namely the fossil fuel industry. But there's no way that we can overall fix our system without realigning incentives, and doing that through more effective, smarter policies, but also just doing that in our own lives and doing that for companies as well to push them to decarbonize as best they can. And that's one role that investors can play in this process. To fully decarbonize a company and fully decarbonize an investment portfolio, we really need to be ensuring that incentives are aligned around just doing the climate math right. So something I do at my day job with Etho Capital related to aligning incentives is the full calculations for the climate footprint of companies and how that relates to creating investment portfolios. And it's really essential that in Climate Geek speak, we're doing full Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 climate accounting, which includes the supply chain emissions and the impacts related to climate change of the products and services that companies put out into the world. And for climate solution companies, we also need to be calculating the avoided emissions for the solutions they're putting out into the world, like renewable energy, sustainable food, different types of electrification technologies. And mobilizing money, of course, is one of the biggest incentives in shifting things out of problems into solutions. Ultimately, we need to be aiming to just make climate solutions the cheapest, best, most available options everywhere we can. And we often talk about the huge investment needed to decarbonize our economy. I'd actually flip that argument on its head and say it's much more expensive to maintain the status quo. The UN estimates that we need to put somewhere around 4 trillion per year invested into climate solutions, but we're already in cash spending more than 6 trillion per year on our current fossil fuel infrastructure. So just flipping that money already is more than sufficient to shift into the climate solutions at the scale that we need to. And if you look at all the subsidies for fossil fuels, including all the price of fossil fuel-based damages linked to pollution from fossil fuels beyond climate change and just direct air pollution, we're actually subsidizing the fossil fuel industry to the tune of over 20 trillion per year. So it's far more expensive to currently continue with the status quo system that it is to decarbonize our economy and shift in a really big, meaningful way. With Etho, just in public markets, we've seen that on average, more climate efficient, sustainable companies financially outperform over time. And of course, I should make regulators happy and say past performance can't guarantee future returns. But if you look at a broad-based index of decarbonization leaders in effectively every industry of the economy, aside from fossil fuels and a few other unsustainable industries, climate leaders are financially outperforming on average. Essentially, we also need to, as a final pillar, be elevating truth around climate solutions, which solutions really are solutions versus those that are just greenwashing, and overall truth about the necessity to act on climate. But not just dwelling on the gloom and doom of what's happening, really elevating that we have all the solutions we need. It's really just a matter of scaling them up and acting on all these different pillars of climate action to ensure that they're scaling up as quickly as we possibly can. So there's lots of different ways to effectively spread the word about what needs to happen in terms of decarbonizing the economy. I've listed a few of them here. I won't go into them in great detail. Certainly what ESGX is doing with this event and more broadly is part of this equation. It's important to know that we're often kind of preaching to the choir in these conversations where we're talking with people who already care about climate change. But most people still don't actually fully understand why climate change is happening. Over 90% of people in every country that I've seen surveyed understand that climate change is happening, because at this point we can almost all see the impacts in our backyards. But fewer than half of people in a whole lot of countries understand that climate change is happening because of burning fossil fuels more than anything else. And of course, deforestation and unsustainable animal agriculture and some other things factor in there as well. But when the vast majority of people still don't understand why climate change is happening, it's hard to then advance the conversation about solutions. And that is a factor that has come from really deliberate misinformation campaigns coming out from the fossil fuel industry. And that's something that we all collectively need to be working to reverse. A key piece related to that we should be elevating into the conversation is that solving climate change will have massive co-benefits for the world. The fossil fuel industry currently kills somewhere around 9 million people every single year, and has for decades. That's based not on some research from some obscure NGO, that's peer-reviewed research coming out of the Harvard School of Public Health, and a number of similar studies have found similar numbers. To put that number into context, that means that fossil fuels are currently killing far more people than COVID ever will, and actually collectively have killed probably more people than every single war in human history, certainly within the last century. And it's pretty staggering when you put things into those terms. This is an industry that we still allow to exist. And again, this is probably a conservative estimate because it doesn't include diseases and deaths linked to cancer and fossil fuel funded wars and oppression, inequality, etc. This is just primarily direct air pollution deaths. And it's not even factoring in additional air pollution deaths linked to climate-driven wildfires, for example, which already have reversed all the progress on the Clean Air Act. So this is just
let's just take a quick pause, though. Can we just take a quick pause and back up a second? You made an important point about elevating truth. I think, Allison, you had a story to share about how best to elevate truth, because this is, we live in a time when what is truth and who is speaking truth and who believes the truth they hear.
Yeah, thanks so much. Happy to chime in with a quick story especially as a journalist, really trying to search for the truth and elevate truth when it comes to investments in climate solutions and climate technologies, which I do have to say a lot of the investment does come from the fossil fuel industry and having the capital and resources and oftentimes as well infrastructure to be able to develop these solutions. And an example is recently I did a story on a carbon capture company based here in Vancouver named Svante, and they recently raised a $300 million Series E round, and that was led by Chevron, the fossil fuel company. Now, this investment is directly in line with Chevron's climate strategy because Chevron is aiming to reduce carbon emissions while continuing to expand oil and gas production. Svante is a company that captures CO2 from the source of industrial emissions. So this is known as carbon avoidance because it doesn't actually remove existing CO2 in the atmosphere. It removes CO2 from what was going to be already emitted. And so as investors and community members and perhaps other writers or journalists in the room today, it's a great kind of question to really look at. When these fossil fuel companies are investing in solutions, how much of their existing budget is being allocated to continue to develop oil and gas? So as I mentioned, Chevron's strategy is dual-ended here. The company's budgeted $17 billion in capital expenditures, and the majority of that spending is still going towards fossil fuels. And only $2 billion is actually going to lower carbon initiatives. So while in our pursuit for truth and looking for truth, we may see companies such as Chevron or other big investment players advocate and highlight the climate solutions that they're investing in, when in reality, you look at how much is actually being invested in, it's perhaps a lot lower than the tune to which they're singing it to. So yeah, a short anecdote in terms of what it means to look into and dig into how these players are getting involved and it's spinning narratives of their own and what it means to dig into that.
Thanks so much, Allison. And I'll, at this point, just briefly say that's one of the reasons that we've collectively come together to launch the Climate Positive Investing Alliance, is to really elevate truth and push investor targets towards what climate science just says is necessary. And it's been great having Ariane and Allison and Paul and a number of others helping us in this adventure. And I'll just skip really to one last piece related to the book, which is at our solveclimate.org site, we are now putting up checklists for how you can apply this 8 pillars of decarbonization framework to effectively every aspect of decarbonization that's needed, from individual lives and homes, that's the example you're looking at here, to what's needed to decarbonize a business, to decarbonize an investment portfolio, or decarbonize a government entity from a city or county, even up to a country. And that's what we hope this framework is useful for, as well as just overall teaching students. And with that, I'd love to hand it over to Ariane to get into any additional thoughts that you'd like to share, and I'll stop talking.
Thanks a lot, Ian. I guess it's wonderful to have this kind of summary of your 8 broad solutions to solve the climate crisis. We'll have 5 minutes to wrap up. I think one question that has been catching a lot of attention today has been around carbon capture versus GHG reductions. I think it's important, and you've laid out really well, that it's a matter of doing both at the same time. It's a matter of reducing our emissions, and within all kind of all aspects of our lives, of society, of us as citizens, of us as consumers, of us as employees, and of us as investors. And I guess something that can be helpful to have a kind of overview of your impact. So with your money is what you've shown, the 3 scopes of emissions. And as individuals, if not done already, just go to your carbon emission calculator, carbon footprint, and then you kind of see all the buckets where your impact is driven by different aspects of your life, and how you can change that. Maybe, so I'll pass over to each of the speakers for a final word about what has been covered here, and maybe a word about your hope, what makes you hope, gives you hope to solve the climate crisis. And then for the questions, I guess we can send a follow-up about if anything hasn't been covered within the time being.
Yeah, I'll just say, what gives me hope is that the solutions really are there, and they're getting better literally every day. We need to scale them faster. But I think actually the biggest thing we need to be doing is elevating truth that they're there, and elevate truth around which solutions really are solutions and are really ready to scale. Because that's the current front of disinformation is not so much around whether or not climate change is happening. It's more about which solutions need to scale up as quickly as possible. And that's what we hope. The book is a good starting point, and we hope the solveclimate.org community that we're building alongside the book is going to help push that even further, including these checklists of climate action from the personal to the company to investor and even government level.
Thanks, Ian. Alison, I guess you have a lot about elevating the truth throughout your daily job. If you want to share any hope or specific action that you've proved very helpful.
Yeah, I honestly have a lot of hope when it comes to communities like these. So big thanks to everyone in the audience and to ESGX for hosting this discussion. It really gives a lot of, I think, optimism to the fact that, yeah, these solutions exist. As Ian mentioned, it's really about getting the right momentum and aligning the right incentives and making sure that the right things go to scale. And it puts us in a place of, yeah, we can solve climate change. The book exists, and the tricks and tips exist, and it's all a matter of us coming together in these communities and acting on it. And with that, I'll pass it back to Nigel.
Fantastic. Thank you all very much. And as we'd all hoped, a fascinating discussion, and First, I wanted to say it's a great reminder in so many of these areas there are solutions, they can be implemented. This whole point about the elevation of truth and focusing on what is possible and real and where the economics really are. I know we talked on the way through, and I'll just show some pictures because there's nothing like a picture for it to be real, even with all this crazy AI stuff going on. We've talked about lime and cement. There's some stuff in the chat about that and the implications also for direct air capture. We've talked about heavy transport. People say, you know, it's all too difficult, and this is a truck from Janus Electric in Australia that, yes, is towing 3 very heavy things. It's got a towing capacity of 100 tons and is thoroughly economic to run. You know, if that's not enough to tow what you're trying to tow on the road, there's nothing that is. People talk about some of these solutions not being attractive in an aesthetic sense. That, you know, we've heard a bit over the years about solar tiles. There are now solar tiles emerging. This is again an Australian company. A lot has happened first there because it's very sunny and power bills were very high. This is a company called Volt, which has got a really nice looking tile, which is really quite cheap in a per kilowatt of generation sense. On the way through, we also talked about agriculture and food systems, and I think this is hugely important. This isn't just about the electrification and decarbonisation, it's about what we do to our environment. And Ian mentioned rice, and here's a great example of regenerative rice growing in India. One of these plants is grown with a traditional approach, the other is grown with no chemicals, much lower input costs, dramatically higher output from the same land area, and you get a higher price per ton because you've got a nicer, greener product. Of course, the challenge with doing that is to educate all the people along the way because it's being done by individual farmers, which of course is hard. So thank you all very much. I was also going to give again, to hope, the other point I wanted to make right at the end is that this is so much about a team sport. There have been all sorts of things going on, continuing to elevate the profile. For anyone that missed it, there was a fascinating discussion last week hosted by the EU around the themes of beyond growth. Or for me, this is more about a shift to a quality economy rather than a quantity economy. And there's events for anyone who is in France. The Change Now conference is this week in Paris. For anyone who's in Italy, there is a significant event coming up, this Green and Blue Festival, in the next week or so. So there's lots going on, lots of places to go and meet people and to put your investments and actions behind all the good words. So thank you all very much. A last word from you, Paul?
Yes, thanks very much, Alison and Orion and Ian, for joining us today. It's so exciting to have a pathway to action and to have it all packaged in this book. Feel free to buy the book. It's at solveclimate.org, to recommend it to your libraries, schools, and universities, and of course to your employers so that everyone can read it. I will be in Oslo next week speaking at the Sustainability Hub in Norway conference. So really appreciate all of your attention. Please share ESGX to help educate, inspire, and encourage everyone to take more action. We'll see you next time on ESGX, and thanks to Nick Gower, our producer.
Thanks, everyone.